Here's an article from the American Free Press. It was an independent newspaper that was written by Michael Collins Piper. I think he's one of the best investigative journalists. Now, you'll never hear much of him in the mainstream media because, well, he talks about the people who basically own the mainstream media. But this was an article from quite a while ago. It was from December 2009. And it was about Palin back in the 2008 election. And he's just basically explaining how the world works. And I thought it would be good to read off this article for people who kind of have some maybe naive perception of how things work in the world. And it'll actually bring up people that I mentioned, or I guess I learned this from reading things like Michael Collins Piper too, of, certain families that have a lot of influence in the United States. Like this one Canadian family he mentions in here actually has a lot of influence in the United States, who had brought about Barack Obama, who was from the 2008 election himself too. And it might seem confusing at first, but the point is, if they influence both candidates, they don't exactly lose when one candidate loses. They still have, their seat at the table, so to speak. But this one is entitled, Palin Praised Big Time Gangster. People ask, why did she do it? In her new memoir, Going Rogue, Sarah Palin goes out of her way to help perpetuate the mass media's long-standing and determined effort to sweep under the rug the very clear and very ugly high-level organized crime history of the Arizona mob fortune that paved the way for John McCain. And John McCain has long passed away. But this still gives you an insight into, how things work, how politics works in the United States, how people rise to prominence to become a senator like he was, and then a presidential candidate back in 2008. Paved the way for John McCain's political career and thus laid the path for Palin's own rise to fame in 2008. In question are Palin's gratuitous and actually unnecessary words of praise for the late father of McCain's wife, Cindy, one Jim Hensley, who was a major figure in the organized crime syndicate and whose beer and liquor fortune said to be worth $100 million bankrolled John McCain's political career. Now, I also bring this up because at one point I saw a video of McCain's wife, Cindy McCain, Hensley, was talking about Epstein, for example, and how bad of a person it was. Well, they weren't exactly that far removed. I guess I could get into that in another video, but let's focus on this one. On this article, In her memoir, Palin wrote, quite falsely, that Cindy McCain has long been victimized and painted in an unpleasant manner by the mass media, when absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. Writing of Mrs. McCain, Palin claimed that, in Cindy's case, the press had been pretty merciless over the years. Because of her upmarket elegance, she's almost ostracized from working-class people. But I loved her life story, which began with her dad starting out poor. He'd pulled himself up by his bootstraps and made a great life for his family. As we shall see in a moment, contrary to Palin's romanticized version of the truth, the public record demonstrates that Palin's suggestion that the media has somehow savaged Cindy McCain is anything but the truth. Likewise, Palin is parroting media lies and helping cover up the McCain family's mob blood money. And essentially, a lot of things that have happened that gotten people into positions of prominence or influence was because of, illicit gains from, the so-called mob, which, isn't exactly like that's portrayed in Hollywood. Hollywood is controlled by usually a certain group of people, and then they try to stereotype Italians, for example, as mobsters when it was really this other certain group of people, which the article will get to in a little bit later. the fact that Palin helps continue a false rendition of history, rather than simply avoiding the subject altogether, which she could do, of course, raises the question as to why Palin went out of her way to praise a top organized crime henchman and whitewash his career. Well, it's because that's the only way you would end up in the mainstream press. And also raises the concern as to whether anything Palin says about what can actually be believed by the voters. And this is actually a collection of articles, this file I'm looking at. It's called The Power Behind Sarah Palin by Michael Collins Piper. I'm sure you can download it somewhere. And there was actually another article about how the mainstream press, things such as the Washington Post, had basically created all this publicity for Palin, good or bad. There's still a great amount of publicity for it, which I'll probably make another video about, or doing a separate video. But critics are inclined to suggest that Palin almost certainly knew the real story behind the story of the mob figure that she praised, but as a part of her effort to further ingratiate herself with the proverbial powers that be, again, that would be those people who own things like the Washington Post. And no, I don't necessarily mean Bezos these days, but back then it was owned by the called Meyer family, who's being described in the other article, which I'll do in another video. That the Alaskan Maverick prayed along with the official cover story regarding the McCain family link to the most powerful organized crime syndicate in American history, one with international connections and even bigger than the so-called mafia that's been immortalized by Hollywood and the mass media in America. That's what I mean. It's more of a stereotyped misnomer there. Perhaps not by surprise, two of the biggest major media voices which have helped cover up the McCain mob connection, the Washington Post, the powerful daily in the nation's capital, and the national magazine Newsweek, owned by the Washington Post Company, are the crown jewels in the post-Newsweek media empire, which is now playing a central role alongside other major media outlets in promoting Sarah Palin's book-selling enterprise and her bid for a frontline presence in the politics of 2012. I think she was trying to be a presidential candidate for the 2012 election. The Washington Post covered up the McCain-Hensley mob connection in its July 22, 2008 edition when it provided readers a glowing account of Mrs. McCain's family, ignoring the more unpleasant facts regarding the Hensley family's source of wealth. The Post declared, Cindy Lou Hensley grew up as an only child. That would be the wife of John McCain, and a privileged one on a large ranch in an upper-class section of Phoenix. Her dad, Jim Hensley, founded what became a large Anheuser-Busch distributorship, and her mom, Marguerite, was a proper belle who emphasized impeccable manners. You notice that a lot of these people got their money around the time of Prohibition, and that's why they're involved with things like beer or liquor or alcohol sales, like Anheuser-Busch distributorships. The families that I had mentioned in the past, things like Bronfman's, Pritzkers, that sort of thing, aren't too far removed from that, especially Bronfman, where that's how they made their money, was through liquor. But here, this was the next page. The Post added almost lovingly that Mrs. McCain was the apple of her father's eye. As if to underscore the legend, the Post-owned Newsweek magazine followed up on June 30, 2008 by echoing the Post, and the Newsweek magazine echoing the Post, and suppressing the big story behind the story, reporting that Mrs. McCain's family was deeply rooted in Arizona, and that her father was one of the most prominent men in the state, was a World War II bombardier shot down over the English Channel. In other words, a war hero like McCain. Newsweek said Hensley borrowed $10,000 to start a liquor business, which became one of the largest Anheuser-Busch distributorships in the country. But Anheuser-Busch owns things like Budweiser, I think, and Busch Light, that sort of drink. and any other alcohol. I'm sure you can Google associated with Anheuser-Busch distributorships in the country, but did point out that the vast Hensley influence and fortune got McCain access to money and connections. And that's how a lot of these people rise to prominence. This came after McCain dumped his ailing first wife and married then mistress Cindy Hensley, and settled in Arizona, where he first ran for office in 1982. And there's a nice little graphic of who they're talking about. There's former Senator John McCain, late John McCain, his wife. There's her dad, the man who bankrolled McCain, and Hensley's essentially mob boss, which was this one. So what is the big untold story covered up by McCain and Palin's promoters, now Palin herself? Contrary to the bootstraps version of history told by Sarah Palin and the Washington Post and Newsweek and other big-time media voices, again, owned by people in that mix of people, in that network of people, the truth is that Mr. McCain's father was a highly placed figure in the Arizona branch of the National Organized Crime Syndicate. He was the chief henchman of late Kemper Marley, Arizona point man for infamous mob chief Meyer Lansky and his powerful partners in crime, the Bronfman family of Montreal, who have gone legit, so they say. And again, they owned a legitimate liquor business, and I think still do to this day. In that capacity, and again, that's the family also involved with Obama. And again, back in the 2008 election, if you're influencing both sides of the election, you can't really lose if one candidate loses. In any case, you still get your influence in a presidential election. Back to the article. In that capacity, for 40 years until his death in 1990, Marley was the undisputed political boss of Arizona, acting as the behind-the-scenes power over both the Republican and Democratic parties. Which is kind of what I was saying, too. As such, his money and connections played the primary role in advancing John McCain's political career from the start. Because you can't run for politics without money. You need a lot of money for ads and campaigning, just running a campaign, hiring all the campaign staff, that sort of thing. Although in 2008 some Democrats muttered that Mrs. McCain's fortune could impact on her husband's decision-making were he elected president, none dared publicly refer to the fact that this wealth was spawned by what others have indelicately, although correctly called, the Jewish Mafia. Yeah, well, with names like Meyer Lansky, they're not Italian, they're Jewish. So the primarily Jewish-owned Hollywood ended up, making all these movies that created the stereotype of Italian mobsters, but in reality, a lot of them were Jewish. Kind of like in this example. Virtually alone among the media. American Free Press, well, because, nobody's going to repeat anything. Nobody's going to publicize Michael Collins Piper because he talks about the people who own them. So, of course, the editors of anybody in, the Washington Post won't be printing any of this stuff. Told and retold the story of the McCain family's intimate ties to the Lansky crime syndicate, and in particular, Lansky's longtime and quite pivotal allies, the Bronfman family of Canada, who are now important figures in the World Jewish Congress. During Prohibition, the Canadian-based Bronfman supplied and thus controlled the spigot of liquor funneled to Lansky syndicate functionaries in the United States, including Al Capone in Chicago. Again, this goes back a long time. After Prohibition, Lansky Bronfman associates such as Marley got control of a substantial portion of liquor and beer distribution across the country. Marley's longtime public relations man, Al Lizanitz, revealed it was the Bronfmans who set Marley up in the alcohol business. In 1948, 52 of Marley's employees, including Jim Hensley, the manager of Marley's company, were prosecuted for federal liquor violations. Hensley got a 6-month suspended sentence, and his brother Eugene went to prison for a year. In 1953, Hensley and this time Marley were prosecuted by federal prosecutors for falsifying liquor records. But young attorney William Rehnquist, which again, this gets interesting too, acted as their mouthpiece, as mob attorneys are known, and the two got off scot-free. Rehnquist later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and presided over the fix that made George W. Bush president in a rightly disputed election. And this is what I mean about, this is a small network of people that are connected to each other one way or another, and this is just another interesting example of it. Arizona insiders say Hensley took the fall for Marley in 1948, and Marley paid back Hensley by setting him up in his own beer distribution business. Newsweek implied Hensley's company was a mom-and-pop operation that became a big success, but the real story goes to the heart of the history of organized crime. Hensley's sponsor Marley was also a major player in gambling, a protege of Lansky associate Gus Greenbaum, who, in 1941, set up a national wire for bookmakers. That would be like sports betting, and, bookies, that sort of thing. After Lansky's longtime partner Bugsy Siegel was whacked for stealing from the Flamingo Casino in Las Vegas, and Las Vegas was essentially founded by the mob, financed in part by loans from an Arizona bank chaired by Marley, Greenbaum turned the wire over to Marley while Greenbaum took Siegel's place tending to the interest of the Jewish mafia in Las Vegas. And again, with names like Meyer, Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel, you can kind of tell that they're not Italian. In 1948, Greenbaum was himself murdered in a mob hit that set off a series of gang wars in Phoenix, but Marley survived and prospered, as did Jim Hensley. McCain's father-in-law also dabbled in dog racing and expanded his fortune by selling his track to an individual connected to the Buffalo-based Jacobs family, key Prohibition-era Lansky Network distributors of Bronfman liquor from across the border in Canada. Expanding over the years, buying up racetracks and developing food and drink concessions at sports stadiums, Jacobs Enterprises were described as being probably the biggest quasi-legitimate cover for organized crimes money laundering in the United States. In 1976, Hensley's mentor Marley, at the height of his power, was the key suspect behind the contract murder of journalist Don Bolles, who was investigating the mob in Arizona. Marley was never prosecuted. Since McCain's career was sponsored by the Lansky-Bronfman syndicate, it was no coincidence that during the 2008 campaign, McCain traveled to London, where Lord Jacob Rothschild of the international banking empire raised money for McCain among American expatriates. What a coincidence. Like the Bronfmans, again, it's a small network of people. Like the Bronfmans, Rothschild has long been a major force on behalf of Israel among the global elite, and that would be what kind of brings them together. That's their unifying theme there. In light of her own devotion to Israel, this may be why Sarah Palin is so enamored of the Jewish mob-connected family that advanced her own patron, John McCain, in the seamy politics of mob-dominated Arizona. And this is another article on how they created Sarah Palin. Might be worthy of another video too. When I say they, I mean people who essentially control the press and political operatives who publicize people like Palin. But that was just an interesting article. I think that, people would find interesting because it's essentially how the world works. And you get to learn who really influences things and how their money plays a large part in influencing or controlling things like politics of even a country like the United States. It might be something you'd think would happen in a small country, but no, it happens in the United States, especially when there are a lot of, resources, or I guess taxpayer money to be essentially embezzled from there. But this was just another example of how the world works. And I'm sure you can download this and many other works by Michael Collins Piper, where they'll cry he's a conspiracy theorist, but, somebody just describing conspiracies isn't a conspiracy theorist. And you'll get to see more of his work, and you'll get to see that he essentially knows what he's talking about. And these people, of course, don't want you to know that. But just thought it would be an entertaining piece there. And that's that for now.